afternoon, everybody. Welcome to today's Beat Bites presentation of best practices for community associations in a post-Surfside world. Today on Zoom, your hostess with the mostest is attorney Melissa Francis. I apologize, I'm having a technical difficulty. Okay, sorry about that. Your hostess with the mostest on Zoom today is Associate Attorney Melissa Francis out of our Plymouth office. That would make me the hostess with the second mostest, Attorney Stacia Miller out of our Mount Clemens office, and I'll be hosting today on Facebook. Little housekeeping stuff right quick. If you could please leave your microphones on mute, and if you have questions, put them in the chat box and we will give them to our presenter to answer as they are received. Today's presenter is our fearless leader, Mr. Gregory J. Fioritto, who's a partner with Zelmanski, Danner, and Fioritto, currently working out of our Plymouth office. Mr. Fioritto is co-chair of the Michigan Community Association Institute's Legislative Action Committee. We've got to come up with a shorter name for that. And he specializes in all things community association related. Without further ado, ladies and gentlemen, Mr. Conway Twitty. I did it again. Wrong great show, guys. Mr. Gregory J. Fioritto, take it away, boss man.
Thank you, Stacia. I know I can always count on you for a sterling introduction. I also want to thank Melissa Francis, who's running the Zoom chat, for the wonderful music. I feel just like Han Solo with my headphones flying the Millennium Falcon. Big Star Wars fan here, but thank you, Melissa. Thank you for joining us today for this video, everybody. And what I want to talk about today is a serious issue that's been in the news for several months, and it's the Surfside disaster. Champlain Towers South, specifically the collapse of the condominium that we've all heard about. I want to talk about it more of as hopefully a learning exercise. You know, what can we learn as community association members, board members, and managers? You know, I'm going to talk about what I see as the fault lines at Champlain Towers, maybe the early indicators that something like this, warning signs that something like this could happen. What were they? Did these things go unnoticed? And hopefully by examining this tragedy, we can, have a better, learn to conduct our own associations in a better way so that this tragedy was not in vain. So the other thing I want to mention just at the outset is, I want to talk about what happened, but we're not going to get into the nitty gritty of the technical issues as to why the towers collapsed, because nobody really knows yet. It's still under investigation. And there's been no definitive conclusion on that. So I'm not going to try to explain exactly why it fell down from a technical perspective, but the way I look at it is, as we start digging into this, somebody might say, well, maybe it was just a sinkhole, or maybe the building just collapsed and nobody could have done anything better. Nobody was at fault. So we're going to dig into the facts here and see how things were actually running at the association. If we dig into it and we see that everything was running tip-top shape, the board was in control of everything was working fine, then yeah, maybe you could say, oh, this was something that was just totally unavoidable. But I think as you're going to see as we go through the facts of what happened at Surfside, it was not what you would call a well-oiled machine as far as a condo association in any sense. And I think you're going to start to see those fault lines more well-defined as to, what perhaps led to this disaster. So with that being said, at the outset here, let's get into the history, the timeline, if you will, of the Surfside collapse. This is one of the many beachfront condominium communities in Florida, in Miami-Dade County, Florida specifically. Multi-story condominium building. It actually had 3 towers, the south, the north, and the east. Champlain Towers South was originally constructed in 1981. So, you're coming up on 40 years in age. And that's going to be important as we go through this. You'll see why that 40-year milestone is really important. This disaster occurred on June 24th, in the middle of the night. The 12-story beachfront condominium partially collapsed. Everybody, I'm sure, has seen the pictures of that. Just an unbelievable tragedy of immense proportions, and something that probably most of us haven't seen ever. I know I've certainly never seen anything like it, doing condominium law in Michigan here for 20 years. So it's really unprecedented. 98 people lost their lives in this disaster, and many others were injured. As you know, if you've been following the news, they were searching for survivors for weeks, and finally brought the search to an end and confirmed 98 people lost their lives. This disaster is tied with the 1922 Knickerbocker Theater collapse as the third deadliest structural engineering failure in the United States. Next slide, please. Okay, so the Moreto Report. What is the Moreto Report? Well, in October of 2018, the association at Champlain Towers, they did obtain a engineering consultant's report on the building. The main driver of this, the driving force of this, was that they had to have a certification. Their 40-year certification deadline was coming up. The county was going to do an inspection. This is a requirement that they had to do an inspection when a structure is 40 years old to make sure it's sound. And that was coming up. So they had to get it in gear. So they hired the Moreto consultants to examine the towers. And they did find major structural damage issues going on, especially with the concrete slab underneath the pool deck. And this was caused by, looks like, waterproofing that was beyond its useful life, depreciated. It was used up. And so, the pool deck is really the focus. If you look at a lot of the reports on this that have come out in the news, the pool deck is really focused on as the origin of the collapse. The exact reason why it collapsed is still up for debate. I should also mention this pool deck was above a underground garage. So you could see, going into the garage, there was damage in there. And they talk about in more detail in these, if you look at the news articles, of planters that were on the pool deck, perhaps were leaking water down through to the garage and causing water damage down there. So, okay, so this was known, this damage, some of this damage, the problem with the pool deck was known as a result of the Moreto Report. Also, they mentioned in the report, the problem with the waterproofing is it didn't allow for runoff. So water would just sit on it and evaporate, which is not the way you're supposed to get rid of water on surfaces, right? So this was a systemic issue, extremely expensive to fix. And these are some quotes from the report. Though some of the damage is minor, most of the concrete deterioration needs to be repaired in a timely fashion. So this is what started to finally light the fire under the board at Champlain Towers to get going on these repairs. Next slide, please. So here is a quote that I thought was really interesting. And as I go through this, if you're on a condo board or you deal with condo boards or HOA boards, I'm sure you're going to relate to a lot of what you hear. It's very, very similar to the things that we hear every day from boards, problems they have running their associations, running their boards. It was no different at the Champlain Towers. This is a quote from a resignation letter from Annette Goldstein, who was on the board of directors, and she quit because she basically couldn't take it anymore. September 2019, she resigned, and we worked for months to go in one direction. And at the very last minute, objections are raised that should have been discussed and resolved right in the beginning. She's talking about the political machinations of the board and the association, right? This pattern has repeated itself over and over: ego battles, undermining the roles of fellow board members, circulation of gossip and mistruths. Circulation of gossip and mistruths. How many of you have heard that in your own associations and through your own boards? I'm sure many of you have. Next slide, please. So, they have the Moreto report in hand, but things stall. The repairs don't get underway right away. They delay. And again, they're working towards that 40-year deadline for the inspection of the county. They engaged Moreto again in 2020 to put together a 40-year building and repair restoration plan with specs for doing all the work that needed to be done. But Moreto is just the engineering consultant, right? They're not the company that's going to come in and actually do the work. So they're just doing engineering stuff, looking at the problems and figuring out a plan for what needs to be done. So as this is going on, the board has spent years clashing with the owners, after the Moreto report about the costs of the repairs that need to be done and the extent of the safety and structural repairs that are really required. I'm sure you can imagine owners will complain and say, hey, do we really need to do this? Do we really need to spend this much money? Are the problems really that bad? As a result of this hemming and hawing and difficulty with the membership, the president and the majority of the board resigned in 2019. And how many of you heard this with your own associations? I quit. I can't take this anymore. I can't be on the board. I can't deal with it. We don't get things done. That's what happened in 2019. So board quits. Several board members quit over the frustration of the slow response to the Moreto report. And if you look at, how many members quit, not only Ms. Goldstein, but 4 other members of their 7-person board, quit in a 2-week span. So huge turnover, board's turning over, nothing's getting done. People are fed up, board members quit. Not a good recipe for any association, let alone one that needs major structural repairs. Next slide, please. So I wanted to include a copy of this letter. This is the actual resignation letter of Ms. Goldstein when she quit the board in 2019. And I'm not going to read the whole thing. Obviously, you can read it for yourself, but she talks about, she had a goal when she got on the board, and it looks like she became disillusioned with the way the board worked. They couldn't get things done. Seems to be a pattern in our building, she says. We work hard, e.g. moving from self-management, exploring it for months, doing our due diligence. Self-management, that's interesting, whether that was a good idea to begin with to be self-managed, but I digress. Doing our due diligence, and suddenly the mood is changed. Egos assert themselves, and we get nothing or little done because the board members are plugging management roles without being able to do the job the board is supposed to do, which is to make important decisions. So clearly not a positive atmosphere on this board. It's not functional. It's dysfunctional, obviously. The pattern has repeated itself over and over again. Ego battles, undermining the roles of fellow board members, circulation of gossip and mistruths. I am not presenting a very pretty picture of the functioning of our board. It's a board that works very hard, but cannot, for the reasons above, accomplish the goals we set out to accomplish. So long story short, long letter short, she quits. And how many of you seen this in your communities? Good people get on the boards with the best of intentions, but because the way the board functions, the way the association functions is so dysfunctional at a basic level, things just don't get done. And that amplifies problems like this, and they only get worse over time. Next slide, please. Here's another quote from a former board member, Max Friedman. It took a lot of time to get the ball rolling. And of course, there was sticker shock. And I've heard that term before with the association boards about a lot of things. Nobody truly believed the building was in imminent danger. Okay, so they knew there were problems, but nobody really thought the building would just collapse one day. And I think you'll find that's a pretty consistent theme through most of the news reporting that you'll read about this is people knew there were issues, but nobody per se knew, hey, the building's about to collapse. Maybe they should have known, that's a whole nother question. They certainly knew there were problems. They certainly had some information to act on. And there certainly were delays in the board's acting on that information. Next slide, please. Okay, so what other factors contributed to this collapse? ongoing debate over the cost and the scope of work that needed to be done. Turnover on the volunteer board, as I talked about earlier, cycling through several new board members in the middle of this. So these repairs that were originally contemplated in 2018 for the 40-year inspection that was coming up in 2021, okay, dragged out, didn't get done right away. Never got done, obviously. Despite increasingly dire warnings from the board, many owners balked at paying for the extensive improvements, which ballooned in price from $9 million to more than $15 million over the past 3 years. As the buildings deteriorated, the cost of this project just kept going up, the estimated cost. And there's that inspection requirement that they were trying to meet. The county requirement needed to be inspected and recertified as safe after 40 years. This is what they were moving. This is what was motivating them. Get this done so we can get this inspection done. As I'm going to talk about later, maybe that wasn't the best way to think about these things. The board voted unanimously to approve. Finally, they voted in 2021 to approve a $15 million, what they call special assessment to pay for upgrades to the building. Now, I want to distinguish special assessments and additional assessments. This always gets confusing with boards in Michigan, especially where we work. In Michigan, what they call a special assessment in Florida is, in my mind, is an additional assessment up here, because they were talking about, as I see it, an amendment, or an assessment that was a board decision and not something that required a membership vote. Okay, so that in Michigan, that's a additional assessment, because you're only doing it for the purpose of repairing or replacing your existing stuff. The building that you have, you're not putting in a new pool, right? And this question comes up all the time. And do we need a membership vote for an additional assessment? And you don't, especially if you're doing it just to repair and replace what you already have. So, but in Florida, they call this type of thing apparently a special assessment. In Michigan, under most bylaws of associations, a special assessment requires a full membership vote. So there's a difference here in Florida from what we're talking about in Michigan when we talk about assessments. Just want to point that out. But the board did approve it in April 13th. Next slide, please. Another quote from a board member, Board President Joan Wadnicki, in October 23rd, 2020 letter. And you can imagine this is probably the letter that goes out where we say, homeowners, you're going to owe a big assessment. You're going to have to pay a big special assessment. I wish I could be giving easier news, but the reality is that we live in an aging oceanfront building that needs work. And how many aging condominiums do we have in Michigan that are coming up on 40 years now? Given that, condos roughly didn't really take off in Michigan until the 70s and 80s, even though the Horizontal Real Property Act authorized them in the 60s. But, in Michigan, you're going to see the same thing. You're going to see structures starting to fail because they're hitting that 30-year, 40-year or longer time period. And you got to maintain the structure. It's not a satisfactory answer for the board to just say, well, we kept assessments low. Assessments haven't gone up in 10 years. You get that all the time. And that's a point of pride for many associations in Michigan. Well, if you follow that road to the end, this is where it leads, in my opinion, with these type of issues. We're working, prioritizing, getting the lowest prices, getting the best loan terms, other ways of containing costs. But our home needs attention, and this is not a surprise. We have known for several years now this was coming. And how many associations know that they have to do repairs, and they just don't assess properly. They don't fund their reserves properly because they want to, look at the short term, and they don't want to make people upset by raising assessments. But this is where that road leads. Next slide, please. Okay, coming up to April of 2021, even at that late time, people were still divided in the community about whether we needed to do this. Do we really need to pay this much money? And yeah, it was a lot of money. You're talking about over $80,000 of an assessment for a 1-bedroom unit. And then they have these penthouse units, at the top, $336,000. So, you think $500 is a lot, a Michigan assessment. And then people will raise all kinds of heck if you have a, $1,000 additional assessment. Okay. Think about this, $80,000. Okay. So maybe we're not that bad off. But they had the assessment. They sent the notice out to everybody. July 1st was the deadline of this year to pay. it was too late though. It was just too late. The owners could pay upfront in one lump sum, or they could do it over 15 years. So those are your choices. They did obtain a loan ultimately to fund this. And, it's not a bad thing for an association to consider loans for this type of thing. And that's a whole nother issue. But they had trouble getting the loan because they didn't properly fund the reserves. So we'll talk about that and how that contributed to these issues shortly. But finishing up the timeline here, even at this late time this year, you had dozens of homeowners at the towers signing letters and saying, we object to this. Please reconsider this assessment. We cannot afford this assessment that doubles the amount of maintenance dues that we're currently paying. How often have you heard that in your Michigan board meetings and association meetings? Oh, and they did hold meetings, everybody. It's not like the board just did this on their own. They had meetings. Guess what? Nobody showed up. Again, same old story, right? Nobody cares. Apathy. People are not involved and invested in their community as they should be. I see this so many times. The only time people do show up is when you tell them you're raising assessments, and that's often the sad truth of it, especially if you have a mismanaged association. So the board had meetings on Zoom during the pandemic, and nobody shows up. You get a smattering of people actually show up for this. Okay, so who's really at fault here, right? Who's at fault? Is it the board, or is it maybe a bigger problem? Next slide, please. Okay, so on top of all this stuff going on down there, you have the pandemic. And as you can imagine, that only made things worse, only increased tensions at the condominium. Another quote from a March 2020 note to the homeowners about a new rule they adopted. Looks like a civility rule, right? No owner, resident, or guest may verbally or physically abuse or otherwise engage in conduct that is offensive, threatening, or harassing to any other owner, resident, or guest. Okay. Now, what was going on to prompt this? I'm sure you can imagine the meetings they did have, the kind of flack they were getting from people about needing to raise assessments, about people that disagreed with what they were doing, harassing the board, probably harassing each other. We see it all the time. And this is why when I do amendments, I'm going to talk about a little bit later, I do anti-harassment provisions to try to eliminate this type of behavior in associations. Another issue, failure to disclose. Not everything, it seems like not everything was shared. There's evidence that they didn't share the Moreto report with purchasers that were buying in after that time, so they didn't know what they were getting into. So, how much did they tell the owners, and how much did they know, and how much did they tell purchasers of what was really the deal? What was the situation with these buildings? So, as I said earlier at the beginning, the cause of the collapse has not been definitively determined. The National Institute of Standards and Technology is the only agency that's now investigating the collapse. They're the ones in there this was as of August 2nd when I was researching this, but they are looking at all kinds of engineering stuff to see, how did this tower collapse? So going back to, generally the causes, again, the signs point to failures near the base of the building and failures with the pool deck as perhaps the origination. And reading some other technical stuff, they say perhaps when that deck failed, it pulled other things down with it. There's some mention of some of the rebar not being to code. The bars that hold the concrete together were not to code. There was some code violations with that. It might have been a design flaw. Maybe there was a design flaw. Okay, that hasn't been ruled out. But as you can see, going through the history of the operations of the board and the association, is it so unreasonable to believe that perhaps it was mismanaged? Just going to put that out there. Next slide, please. All right, so now the $64,000 question, or maybe it's the $1 million question in today's economy, inflation and everything, but what can we Michigan Community Association members, boards, and managers learn from the Surfside tragedy? Let's try to learn something from this. And I hope this is a watershed moment for a lot of boards, that you can't do business, the same old way. You gotta start doing things right to avoid these issues. Next slide. All right. So now in Michigan, we don't have a lot of high rise, certainly oceanfront high rises. We don't have that issue. We don't have a lot of giant towers. I mean, you have some in the more urban areas. But that doesn't mean, just because we don't have giant high rises, doesn't mean we don't have the same issues. Doesn't mean we don't have the same problems with associations not maintaining their roofs, their roads, their windows, their doors, not looking at the foundations, addressing foundational issues properly. And I stole this, I have to admit, I stole this from Tracy and Melissa's presentation last month. So thank you for that. But I just wanted to touch on this again because, just because you're not in Champlain Towers in Florida doesn't mean you're immune from these problems. Quite the contrary. I think you have the exact same problems, just in a different, maybe with different issues. Okay. Next slide, please. So, all right. So identifying these fault lines, the Surfside fault lines, where did this go wrong? And I think you'll see that I've kind of distilled down everything I've talked about so far to these, 10 points or so. They didn't engage their engineer in a timely fashion or on a regular basis. They did it because they had a 40-year study coming up. Okay. They didn't act on the advice in a timely fashion. Okay. They got the Moreto Report in 2018. They didn't approve the assessment till 2021, when the place collapsed. High board turnover, lack of continuity among board members. Think about these governance issues. You cannot have a well-run association if you have new people coming in every year. That's why you have a staggered board. And I'll talk about how you can do that by amending your documents to require that. Dysfunctional board, clearly egos, hostility. They can't make decisions. They can't, get things done. They can't follow through on decisions they actually make. They're kind of going in circles and chasing their tails. Lack of transparency, as I just mentioned a few minutes ago, they didn't disclose perhaps a lot of this to the people they should have disclosed this information to, namely the members as well as potential purchasers. Toxic atmosphere in the association, hostility, harassment, and abuse of members. Okay, it seemed like they had that problem in spades. Now here's the nitty gritty, or the big reason, and a lot of this, the rest of my presentation is devoted to this. Their reserve account was not properly funded. They didn't have money in reserve to do the repairs and replacements they needed to do when they needed to do them. Huge problem. They didn't have a professional reserve study done until 2020. Okay, so right before this happens, they finally got their act together and hired a professional company. I think the name was Association Reserves, to come in and give them a reserve study to tell them what they needed to do. But it's too late. Difficulty in obtaining loans. They were turned down twice for a loan. Okay. Why? Because they didn't have reserves. They didn't have money in reserves. The banks are going to look at that. If you don't got money in reserves, you ain't getting the loan. Okay. You can't have your cake and eat it too. You gotta fund your reserves to be able to get the loan to do the repairs. Can't play it all on the cheap for 20 years, not fund everything properly, keep assessments low, and then think you're going to get the loan to make everything all right. It's poor strategy. And the last item down there is, I can't see it on my, particular slide, but, waiting until the last minute, waiting until the 40-year inspection, the date was, to do that. Don't wait till year 40 to do this. They should have been planning for a different purpose, not to meet a 40-year inspection. They should have been planning on a regular basis. They should have been doing preventive maintenance on the structures all along, but they weren't. Next slide, please. All right, so let's talk about best practices in a post-Surfside world. What should associations be doing from what we've learned? Well, again, as I just mentioned, this association, Champlain Tower South, they were critically underfunded. Okay, that is a fact. The reserve study that they obtained from Association Reserves told them this. They only had 6.9% in reserves in order to do what they needed to do to repair and replace the items. Many of the items on the reserve study, the components, had zero years of remaining useful life. Okay, that means you're done. You got to replace that item. Okay, that included the entrance and the garage where concrete was cracking, and as I said earlier, the garage might have been part of the origination of the collapse, where water was leaking down from the pool deck into the garage. Okay, this association had $706,000 in its reserves as of January 2021. That's all they had. Okay. And they ended up needing a $15 million loan. So that tells you everything you need to know right there. They were recommended to have 10.3 million. They should have had 10.3 million in reserves. They had 706,000. Okay. Obviously, they were at high risk of a special assessment and deferred maintenance. Well, no kidding. Yeah, that's what happens. Next slide, please. All right. So let's talk a little bit about reserve studies. This is again from, I think it's from a Washington Post article that I was researching this. Robert Nordland from Association Reserve says 30% of condos nationwide are in the same high risk category, at a high risk of needing an additional assessment or special assessment. Okay, with less than 30% of the required reserves. As I mentioned, this board had never obtained a reserve budget study according to a November 2020 PowerPoint they gave to the residents. They never had one until they got the last one they got in 2020. As I mentioned earlier, if you don't have reserves, can't get a loan. It just makes the problem worse. You're going to have to additionally assess if you can't get a loan. Okay, you have to assess more the smaller loan that you're able to get. So eventually they did get the loan for $12 million, okay, from Valley National Bank. And the $15 million special assessment was levied to pay back the $12 million loan. Okay, so they didn't get away with having their cake for 40 years and eating it too, not in any sense. So I want to give a little plug here because Tracy and Melissa, my partner Tracy Danderbond and Melissa Francis, who is helping me run this presentation, they did a great power beat session last month dealing with emergency and disaster preparedness. It's on our YouTube channel at ZDF Condo and HOA Attorneys on YouTube. Just run a search and you can watch that session anytime. So having plugged that, we will move on to the next slide, Melissa. Okay, so what exactly is a reserve study? And this is something that Melissa and Tracy covered last month, so I don't want to get too deep in the weeds on this and repeat too much of it, but it's a long-term planning tool to identify, what do you have in reserves, first of all. It helps you create a funding plan to fund reserves to offset the deterioration and depreciation of your property. Obviously, this is going to help maintain property values and your investment in your home if you're doing this right. It gives you a report to help establish a schedule of reserve contributions that are fair and impartial to the present and future owners in the condominium. It's a way to assess the reasonable life expectancy of the common elements and ensure that the association has funds to repair, replace, and also include preventive maintenance to make the costs of repair and replacement lower over time. If you're maintaining things properly, there's less of a need to do wholesale repair and replacement. So preventive maintenance is another important topic, part of a reserve study, but I'm not going to get into that in detail today, but just know that it is another thing you should consider: maintenance, preventive maintenance. Next slide, please. All right, so real basic, what is a reserve study exactly? What are the components? Well, there's two components of a reserve study. There is the physical analysis and there's the financial analysis. And this is courtesy of the Community Association Institute Reserve Specialist, RS designation. A lot of this material is on this Community Association Institute website. I highly encourage you to check it out if you're on a board or want to do more research. There's a ton of information about reserve studies and this type of thing on the CAI website. Don't go to the CIA website. You'll find different stuff there. Okay, you might get in trouble. Don't go to the CIA website. Anyway, so what are the components? Physical and financial. The physical is the inventory of the various components of your community that need to be maintained, the condition assessment of those components, and a life and valuation estimates. The financial part is, the fund status. How much do you have in reserve? And then funding plan. How are we going to put money into reserve? Next slide, please. Okay, and I also want you to be aware that there are 4 levels of a reserve study. It's not just like one thing you get. There are different kinds, different levels with different, grades of what you get. Okay, so if you go full reserve study, you're going to get everything. You're going to get component inventory, condition assessment, based on-site visual observations. And that can be very important to have an on-site inspection as part of your study. Okay, you might have to ask for that specifically. Say, I want the full reserve study. I don't want some guy just doing a drive-by, right? And just driving by and saying, no, I think this is what it's going to cost. You know, you got to have that on-site visual observation inspection for a full study. And it obviously includes the other components, life and valuation, funding, and fund status and funding. So that's the full-on level 1 reserve study. Level 2, you're going down a little bit, updated with site visit and on-site review. This is a reserve study update in which the following tasks are performed. You can read the requirements. It's a step down from the level 1. So that's basically what you need to know, is like we're kind of moving down to less involved studies with these 4 levels. So that's level 2. Level 3 is on the next slide. And I'm gonna try to move a little bit more quickly because I'm running out of time, but level 3 is no site visit and only includes the 3 components that are listed there. And level 4 is like at the bottom. This is what your developer does before the community is built. Okay, so you don't really have to worry about level 4. Level 4 is like what your developer should have handed you when they built the place. So there are 4 levels, and understand if you're asking for a reserve study, understand what study you're asking for. And if you have a lot of structures that need maintenance, you're going to probably want to go with a full study, especially if you've never had one. Next level, please. Next slide, please. Okay, so what about how often should you have a reserve study if you're an association? Michigan doesn't require any, kind of time interval for your reserve study. Some states do. California does require, for example, every 3 years you have to have a reserve study. Other states say once every 3 or every 5 years. And, some management companies and reserve study companies might say every year. That's going to depend on the type of community you have, though. Again, if you have a very common element intensive community with a lot of amenities, then you're going to need this more often. If you're in an association that does not have that, or maybe doesn't have any of the common amenities structures, like a site condominium where I live, then probably not, you don't need it nearly as often. So it depends on the community. The interval should depend on the type of community in which you live. Only 9 states actually require you to have a reserve study. Maryland has some of the more onerous requirements, or maybe better requirements, I should say, as far as these things go. You got to have one every 5 years, and you actually have to fund it. Not only have the study, but fund the plan. You have to have a funding plan and actually be funding those repairs. So again, the interval for doing it will best, really you got to look at the type of community you have to best determine how often you should have a reserve study. Next slide, please. A little bit more on reserve studies. I'm going to move a little bit faster because I want to finish in time. But state law in Michigan does require you to have a reserve fund for condominiums only, not HOAs. And the amount you're required to have is 10% of the association's current annual budget on a non-cumulative basis. This means if your annual budget is $100,000, then you should have at any given time, well, your budget is that amount, you should have $10,000 in your account. So 10% of that budget. Obviously, this is going to be inadequate, okay, most of the time, because it's arbitrary. It's not really based on the need of your community. It's a totally arbitrary administrative code requirement that some administrator made up like 20 years ago, and it hasn't been changed since. And we're trying to change it, and I'll talk about that a little bit at the end of the presentation. FHA certification does require you to be earmarking funds for your reserve fund and to have one. So if you're interested in getting FHA certification for your condominium, you got to have this. There are no Michigan or federal reserve fund requirements for HOAs or co-ops, right? Because there's no statute for HOAs, so this doesn't apply. HOAs are kind of on their own, and just. But again, there's less of a need for HOAs to do this, although probably still a need to have at least some analysis done. Next slide, please. Okay, can we improve our laws? Well, this is something I'm trying to do as a co-chair of the Michigan Community Association Institute Legislative Action Committee that I am on. We are trying to make the laws better. And there's a slide at the end of this, which gives you some more information about it. If you want to look it up online, we appreciate any donations that people can give. There's not a lot of lobbying and support out there for associations, but that's what we're trying to do. I'm working with at a national level with the CAI Public Policy Task Force to update its policy. The national policy will then become the basis for the individual states to try to get adopted in their, with their individual legislatures. And that's what we're going to try to do. The new policy is actually supposed to be introduced this month, hopefully later tonight at the national conference that is taking place. And once we have that policy, the Michigan LAC is going to take that to the legislature, actually talk to the legislature, hopefully get a bill introduced to make our laws better in Michigan. Next slide, please. So what are the things that we could do to make our laws better? And think about this just from a practical perspective, even if the law never changes, this is what you should think about as far as the do's and don'ts of reserve studies. They should be prepared, first of all, in accordance with national standards. And that goes back to the 4 levels that I talked about. And there's obviously more detail in those standards if you go look them up, but there's national standards for how they should be done. I already talked about the level 4 developer studies. Maybe that should be required as a state law that the developer has to do that and give that to the association. When you buy a unit, why shouldn't they? And the developer should be required to fund the reserves and provide funding disclosures and tell you as an owner, how much money do we have in reserves, and is it going to be adequate to fund our association? The developer should be required to do this. And then on the association side, post turnover, should we require associations to not only have a reserve study? That's one question, is should the law say you must have a reserve study, but should you be required to fund your study, to actually put the money in to do what the study says you're supposed to do? So funding, there is a difference between just having the study and having a funding plan to fund the study. Okay, you got to take the next step. You can't just do the study. How often should we require them to be done? We're talking about maybe 3 years, maybe 5 years. Some people at the national level, the CAI say should be every year. 5 years is way too long, but that probably depends on what state they live in. And, they got a bunch of high rises, it probably is inadequate for those type of states. Other things we're talking about, requiring disclosure. Disclosure is a big thing that could really help. Require disclosure to members. And require disclosure of reserves to new buyers in the condominium so that they know what they're getting into. And then, should we require that the reserve study be prepared by a professional? Some boards do their own reserve studies, and that's better than nothing, I guess. But shouldn't you hire somebody who is an engineer or an architect or somebody who is a professional to do this type of a study for you? Should that be a legal requirement? Next slide, please. So document amendments. I want to say a few things about what you could do to fix your documents to prevent these types of issues from happening. First of all, make sure there's no provisions in your bylaws that prevent the board from levying an additional assessment if the purpose of the assessment is to repair or replace your existing common elements. And this is how the vast majority of documents in Michigan already read, but occasionally you'll see a weird limitation on the board's power to assess, again, for the purpose of only of repairing or replacing. I'm not talking about say giving unlimited power to the board to fund an assessment to do anything at all, to put in a new structure. We're not saying that. We're saying for maintenance, repair, replacement, they should have the power to impose additional assessments. And there shouldn't be limits on that because that'll prevent them from doing their job, which is to maintain, repair, replace your common elements. Again, for HOAs, the rules are gonna be a little bit different. HOAs often have limits in their documents that will say, we can't increase the assessment more than 10% in the previous year or something like that. That's fine. HOAs have a different scenario. It's a different scenario. Limitations are more reasonable, make more sense in the HOA context, but not for condominiums. Remove any provisions from your bylaws that might hinder the board from setting the budget. The vast majority of documents in Michigan don't limit the authority of the board to set the budget, but if you do have something in there, again, you may want to look at removing that. And again, that's different for HOAs. It's more common to see that in HOAs and more acceptable in the HOA context to have limits on the board's budget setting authority. And of course, setting the budget determines assessment. So that's what I'm really talking about is, setting the annual assessment. A few other things, harassment. You can amend your bylaws to prohibit harassment, at least give you something in the documents to perhaps send a notice of violation to somebody if they're harassing the board or harassing somebody or using profane language or, abusing them in some fashion. Set some standards in your documents to say this is unacceptable and we're not going to allow it in our community. Make sure your bylaws require the board to have staggered terms. You don't want the whole board turning over every year or every 2 years. You want to have it staggered. So you have 3 and 2 if it's a 5-member board, or 4 and 3 if it's a 7-member board. Every year stagger the turnover so only a portion of the board is replaced every year. Next slide. So as we move to conclude here, a few other amendments. Take a look at your insurance provisions. Make sure they're correct. Have them reviewed by an attorney who knows what they're doing. Often developers make mistakes in insurance provisions. You might not have the coverage that you think you have, or maybe you have the wrong coverage in light of your bylaws. So generally, most associations in Michigan have single entity coverage, which means it will have enough money under the association's policy to repair and replace your unit in its entirety as it was built by the developer. And that's what's called single entity. Now, if you have a bare walls requirement in your bylaws, you might want to change it to single entity. Some associations like bare walls because they don't want to pay for things inside units, but it creates other problems and there are downsides to it. You could have gaps in coverage if the co-owner does not have their own insurance. So after a casualty loss, you could have a big problem if they don't have insurance, and neither does the association. So that's one thing you could do. I'd say remove any incidental damage provisions from your bylaws. This is, again, a clause that could create unlimited liability for the association, even if there's no negligence. And, some associations, maybe they like that. They want the association to cover everything that happens if it was caused by a common element like a roof leak. But that basically makes you the insurer for every co-owner. Do you want that over the long run? Amend your bylaws to shift deductibles. If the association is carrying a $5,000 deductible, you probably don't want the association to eat that as a group if somebody was at fault or somebody caused that loss. So look at your insurance provisions to make sure you have provisions that make sense and you know what they are, and you have enough coverage under those provisions. Next slide, please. Other things you could do. Well, don't wait for the law to change. Amend your bylaws in regard to reserve requirements. Okay, you can amend your bylaws to say our association should have a reserve study done every 3 years or every 5 years. That's fine. You could do that. It's not often done, but that was before Surfside. So most bylaws just don't say anything about it. They just say the standard, we should have 10%. And it's, again, arbitrary and probably meaningless to have that amount in reserve. Require the association to actually fund the study that you get, not just get the study, but actually put the money aside to fund it. Require your association to disclose to members and potential buyers whether a reserve study has been done and whether there's a funding plan in place and the current level of funding of that plan. Require the reserve funds to be kept in a separate account so that they're not mixed with your operating funds and spent on things they shouldn't be spent on. And maybe require the reserve study to be performed by an outside independent professional or an engineer, not just by the board themselves. Next slide, please. Other things, other issues, these fault lines that we could fix. Have an ethics policy so that board conduct is governed and people know the expectations for board conduct, so that people don't get into fights and have to deal with ridiculous hostility. It can be a very useful tool if everybody buys into it. Re-examine your board processes. Are you doing things according to Hoyle? Do you take your votes at meetings instead of by email all the time? I think it's better to discuss things at meetings. Are you keeping minutes? Do you retain professionals and engineers when you need to? When an issue comes up that you should have an engineer? Does everybody help, or is it just one person running everything? I think things run better when you're following the rules and everybody gets to vote, not just have one person making all the decisions. Are you following Robert's rules? I'm not saying follow all the complicated rules that associations follow at the association level. I'm saying just, there are rules for small boards that are very easy to follow, and they make it easier to make decisions and to stick to decisions as a board. And these are helpful rules to follow to get things done. Make sure you're doing your review and audit annually. This is a requirement under state law, Michigan. Unless you vote to opt out, if your budget is more than 20K, you must have a a review or an audit done by a CPA every year. Okay. And if you do the review, there are requirements of the accountant, of reporting requirements that they have to meet regarding reserve studies. So it ties into the reserve study issue, ties into your accounting and what kind of reviews and audits you're having done. Okay. So these things tie together, and your accountant will definitely need to know what you've done for reserve study and include that information. in their report according to their, GAAP standards and accounting standards. The board should not tolerate harassment or abusive behavior. There's things you can do to stop that, and I've already talked about them. But if you have that going on in your community, you probably have a poorly functioning community. If you have a well-run community, in my opinion, you're less likely to have the harassment and the outrage and hostility. If you're being transparent, if you're doing things right, you're less likely to run into that. Next slide, please. So how do we prevent that dysfunction that we saw at Surfside? Number one, be transparent. Any support you get, share them. Sometimes, occasionally, there'll be legal reasons why you can't share something, but most of the time, what the board sees should be what the membership sees. Keep the community up to date on the status of the budget during the year. Are you over budget? Are you under budget? That's part of what my association does. Is every month we get a report, about the individual items in our budget and whether we're over or under, and what we still have in reserves. If the board decides that an assessment increase is warranted, this needs to be explained to the people based on the facts, based on the engineer's report. Bring the engineer to the meeting, get the roofing guy to the meeting, have them be face-to-face with your members, so that they can tell them exactly why this needs to be done. Okay, and you got to do that. And if you do these things, you'll have a better result. Conduct your meetings, conduct informational meetings, conduct open board meetings often to keep your membership informed and be transparent with them. And don't try to over plan to catch up. I had one community that I represent, our firm represents, that, we were underfunded for a long time and living on the cheap. And finally they had to pay the piper. And they had an accountant, put together a budget and a plan to say, this is how we're going to do this for 15 years. For the next 15 years, we're going to increase the assessment, these amounts. And it's like, well, who's going to be on the board in 5 years? We don't know. I don't think it's practical to have like a 15-year plan, and it probably won't go down well with your membership. So don't try to make up for lost time by doing something that's really going to be unpopular and just backfire on you. You got to be reasonable and practical with people, with your membership. Next slide, please. So we have gotten to Pugsley, the dog, who is my favorite slide, and I always make sure Melissa includes him. And so there he is, and here we are. Thank you, Pugsley. And if you have any questions, I'll be happy to take them in the chat or later on. Just email us. We'd be happy to try to help you. I hope that this has been informative. I think we're just about at 1 o'clock, so pretty much out of time. But if anybody has any last-minute questions, I'll be happy to take them. Do we have any questions, Melissa?
Nope, there are no Zoom questions.
No Zoom questions? Any Facebook questions?
No Facebook questions.
Okay. So if you're interested in supporting the Michigan Legislative Action Committee, please check out our website. The link is on the page, and we would appreciate any support, whether you're a board member or an individual. Any support from your association or yourself would be greatly appreciated and help make our laws better in Michigan. And if there are no questions, my phone number is on the slide, as is my email address. So thank you very much for joining me today. And I hope you have a great day, the rest of your day, and be well.